You see the Israel-Gaza conflict in the headlines all the time, right? But the roots of this thing run so deep. To really get a handle on what's happening today, you have to look at the decades of history that got us here. So in this explainer, we're going to trace that story. Yeah, it's a huge mistake to think of this as just one single war. It's really more like this complex tapestry, woven from historical grievances, competing dreams for a nation, and a cycle of violence that has profoundly shaped the lives of generations.
So how did it get to this point? How did it become so deeply entrenched? To really understand today's headlines, we've got to peel back all those layers and look at the key moments that brought us here.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We'll start with why this is such a long, protracted conflict. Then we'll dig into the genesis of the strife, the very beginning. After that, we'll look at the Gaza blockade, the cycle of war that followed, the very real human cost, and finally, why peace has been so elusive.
All right, first up, it's absolutely crucial to see this not as an event, but as a protracted generational struggle. So where did this all begin? Let's rewind and get to the genesis of the modern conflict.
So if you're looking for a starting point for the modern conflict, pretty much everyone points to the 1948 war. For Palestinians, this event is known as the Nakba, which means catastrophe. And it's called that because it led to this massive displacement, creating a huge refugee population with so many of them ending up right in the Gaza Strip. So for a while after 48, Egypt was actually administering Gaza. But then came this huge shift in 1967. That's when Israel captured the territory during the Six-Day War, and this kicked off a military occupation that would last for decades. And, that really ratcheted up the friction, and it eventually exploded into the first major Palestinian uprising, which you might know as the First Intifada.
Things were obviously tense for decades, but then in the mid-2000s, something happened that completely changed the game. And that brings us to our next section, the Gaza blockade.
So it starts in 2005. Israel makes this big move. They pull all their troops and settlers out of Gaza. But what happens next? It creates a power vacuum. The very next year, the militant Islamist group Hamas actually wins the Palestinian legislative elections. And by 2007, after a short, sharp conflict with their rivals, Fatah, they seize total control of the territory.
And that Hamas takeover, it was an absolute game changer. In response, Israel and Egypt imposed a strict land, air, and sea blockade on the Gaza Strip. And that blockade, it's been in place now for over 18 years. Just let that sink in.
Now, this blockade is one of those issues where you have two completely different ways of looking at it. On one hand, from Israel's security perspective, it's seen as totally necessary to stop Hamas from getting weapons. But on the other hand, for Palestinians and a lot of the international community, it's viewed as a form of collective punishment that has absolutely devastated Gaza's economy and created a massive humanitarian crisis.
You might think the blockade would lead to some kind of quiet, but nope. It did the opposite. It kicked off a new and really devastating phase, a repeating cycle of war. And you start to see this grim, predictable pattern emerge. There'd be some kind of trigger, escalating rocket fire, a targeted killing, something like that, and it would be followed by a massive military response from Israel. Just look at the major operations here. 2008, 2012, 2014, all of them were incredibly destructive.
And here's the thing, even in the years between these big wars, the conflict never really stopped. Starting in 2018, for instance, you had these huge weekly protests at the border fence, the Great March of Return, demanding an end to the blockade. They often turned violent, and there were always smaller but frequent flare-ups. Okay, so behind all the politics, the military strategy, what does this all mean for the people who actually live there? That's the real question. Let's talk about the human cost.
What you have here are two parallel and frankly brutal realities. For the more than 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, life is often described as being in an open-air prison. You're talking about a destroyed economy, soaring unemployment, and not enough clean water or electricity. At the same time, for Israelis living near the border, life is a constant state of alert. Imagine the psychological toll of air raid sirens going off, the ever-present fear of rocket attacks, and the need to run to a bomb shelter at a moment's notice.
Which brings us to the big, difficult question. With so much violence, so much suffering on all sides, why is lasting peace so incredibly hard to find? Well, from the Israeli perspective, it really boils down to security. The
The argument is that the military operations, the blockade, they are all necessary measures to protect their citizens from attacks by Hamas and other militant groups.
But if you look at it from the other side, for Hamas and for many Palestinians, this isn't seen as terrorism. It's framed as legitimate resistance, a fight against what they see as a decades-long military occupation and a crippling siege on their home.
And that right there gets to the very heart of why every ceasefire, every truce, seems to eventually fall apart, because they never actually solve the fundamental core issues. We're talking about the huge questions: Palestinian statehood, what happens to Jerusalem, the right of return for refugees, and maybe the biggest one of all: how do you guarantee real, lasting security for both Israelis and Palestinians? And that leaves us with the central and frankly heartbreaking question. Without some kind of real, meaningful, and just political process that actually gets to the bottom of these core grievances, are both peoples just trapped? Are they stuck in this devastating and seemingly endless cycle? That's the question we're left with.